Hi, Eva. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much.
You were just in Venezuela. How, in your eyes, have the sanctions affected the Venezuelan people? And what's your impression of the support for the government of Nicolas Maduro now?
Yeah, well, I was in Venezuela at a time when international media was insisting there was a state of chaos in the streets in Caracas, and they were insisting that due to the sabotage in the electrical grid, although they did not admit it was sabotage, they insisted that the people were against President Maduro. However, I was able to attend two different rallies, in addition to another day in which hundreds of motorcycles, Venezuelan citizens, came to the National Assembly to defend the peace of the National Assembly. On March 16th, they joined a mass demonstration where there were thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of demonstrators who walked for hours. It was a very lively demonstration. They were very vocal in why they had come to that demonstration, what they were defending. They were defending their Bolivarian revolution, their government, and they were against imperialism. They were very clear about their knowledge of what the U.S. is trying to do to Venezuela. And they also, when I asked them about Juan Guaido, they rejected him as any sort of leader, and they firmly stated that the president was Nicolas Maduro. I did also attempt to go to opposition rallies on two different occasions. On the 16th, there were supposed to be opposition rallies, but no one turned out. And on March 30th, I actually got on a motorcycle taxi. I went around to Candelaria, to El Paraíso, and eventually to Chacao and Altamira. In El Paraíso, I could not find any sort of opposition supporters. However, I did find a group of protesters supporting President Maduro walking towards a larger mass demonstration that occurred later in the day, but I found no opposition supporters. In Chacao, I found a couple handfuls of opposition supporters, and same in Altamira, which, as you know, is supposed to be one of the strongholds of the opposition in Caracas. So it was interesting to see that in spite of all the claims on Twitter, social media, that Juan Guaido has mass support, I wasn't able to find any, and I certainly did try. However, walking the streets in Caracas, whether in Western Caracas or downtown, I did find support for Nicolas Maduro.
And Eva, first of all, I wanted to say that all the images we're showing are, of course, the images that you filmed while you were there. As you said, you were there during the time that the country was hit by a sabotage against the national power grid. What did you see with regards to that? And I also wanted to ask you about these images that you have when you were documenting residents collecting water. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So the images you're showing on screen, I took within the first few days on my arrival, and I arrived on March 10th. And so I was basically trying to show that whereas corporate media was saying that the shelves are empty in supermarkets. In fact, during a power outage in which the metro was shut down, there were still stores open, and restaurants open and food stalls open. And obviously you can see ordinary Venezuelans patronizing these places. That's not to say that all Venezuelans, the poorest Venezuelans, could patronize them, could visit them, but there are other systems in place to subsidize, to provide food for them. And I went to, although it's not being shown on the screen, I went to Patari, and even there, in the highest barrios in Patari, I found signs of people selling chicken and other meats and cheese and vegetables. You could see produce when you went to the main square in Patari. You saw all sorts of shops open selling meats, and also pharmacies open. So clearly what I was seeing was a stark contrast to what corporate media was insisting. And I think it was really important to point that out, because corporate media, international media, was trying to paint a scene of chaos in Venezuela, and I did not see that. And I do like to point out that I lived in Caracas in 2010, and the Venezuela I was seeing in March was not a whole lot different from 2010, except there were less people on the streets because the metro wasn't running. And I did go up to the mountain of Huayra Repana, I believe it is, and I saw two different instances of water collection. One was a government-organized water collection in which there were big tankers that were filling up with mountain spring water, clean, drinkable water, and they were being sent around the city with a priority of attending hospitals and bringing water to hospitals. And the other thing I saw on the same mountain was, again, mountain springs, Venezuelan citizens calmly waiting to collect water. And this, I think, was very important to emphasize the calmly. Yes, there was a power outage due to the sabotage, and yes, this affected the water supply, but Venezuelans, everywhere I went, were calmly waiting for whatever it was, whether it was drinking water or whether it was at an ATM when the power was back on. And so on this mountain, I saw people collecting water to take back home. I also was able to speak with people with dissenting views. One person was very open about her views on President Maduro. She wasn't incredibly nuanced. The other woman I spoke with was very nuanced on what she was defending, on being aware of what the U.S. was attempting to do in Venezuela. And this was a theme I saw over and over again. Whenever I did have a chance to speak to an opposition supporter, I found a lack of nuance, a lack of direction or actual ideas on what they wanted for the country. Whereas when I spoke to supporters of Venezuela, supporters of the Constitution and the government, I found that they were very, very well versed on why they were defending Venezuela. So I think it's just important to say there was not the state of chaos that corporate media was trying to paint, and there was not this massive people in the streets trying to oust President Maduro. To the contrary, I saw a defense of the president and the Constitution in the country.
And Eva, finally, I'd like to ask you how you'd relate what you've reported on in Venezuela to some of the other places you've reported on, and like with reference to the corporate media in North America, specifically maybe the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, since you're in Ontario now.
Yeah. Basically, I see the same pattern of regime change propaganda that I've seen with Syria, and of course that we've all seen with Libya before, with Iraq, with so many other nations being targeted by imperialists. And this pattern is first the extreme demonization of the leadership of the country. So in the case of Syria, President Assad; in the case of Venezuela, President Maduro. It's very cartoonish rhetoric that is intended to sway a Western public into believing there's a need for the West to go in and quote unquote save the people in these countries. And then along with that, you have more and more propaganda along the lines of people are starving, there's chaos in the streets, the government's cracking down on protesters. To the contrary, in Caracas, I saw they weren't guarimbas, but they were people setting up barricades and lighting them on fire in the middle of Caracas, and the police and the National Guard were allowing them to do this. And I was told by local journalists this was a form of protest in order to draw attention to a specific need they had. Now, not to be confused with guarimbas, which obviously you know well, but for viewers, the guarimbas are very violent street protests that attack civilians. But these particular ones were isolated. And I was told by local journalists that once their need is met, for example, a water tanker, the barricades are disassembled. And so my question is, if, according to corporate media, this is a dictatorship that is cracking down on protesters, why are there people in the streets allowed to set up these barricades in the middle of busy streets, disrupt life, set things on fire, and they are not being quashed down upon? The answer is because what the corporate media has been portraying is not true. So in the case of Syria, they've been saying for years that the president and the army are cracking down on the people. It's not true. In fact, in contrast, the people are the army, and they support the army, and they support the president. And I know it's not black and white the same exact in Venezuela, but I'm seeing the parallels that the corporate media, the international media, is trying to sell to a Western public that the Venezuelan government is bad and we need to save them. It's extremely ironic and hypocritical, if I may, Camila, because the sanctions, as you mentioned at the beginning, are dramatically affecting Venezuelans' lives. We've seen a report by American economists recently saying 40,000 people from 2017 to 2018 have died as a result of the sanction, and hundreds of thousands more are at risk. And we know the effect the sanctions have had on Syria and on many other states. And if I can just make one other point, since I did live in Gaza. In Gaza, the power plant, the Sol power plant, was attacked by Israel in 2006. And since then, Palestinians have not been able to adequately reconstruct the power plant, meaning since then, they've suffered power outages of up to 20 hours of no power a day. So these hypocrites, Marco Rubio, John Bolton, all these U.S. talking heads, pretend to care for Venezuelans when there is a sabotage on your grid, which causes a power outage for a number of days. It's quite clear their hypocrisy when they don't care about the Palestinians in Gaza or the people of Yemen or the many other countries where preventable and real crises have taken place as a direct result of imperialist or Zionist policies.
Thank you so much for reporting back following your trip to Venezuela. We've been speaking to Eva Bartlett. She's speaking to us from Canada and recently returned from reporting on the ground in Venezuela.